So as you see, the title of my presentation is Metal Studies in Central and Eastern Europe, the crucial questions of a field of research under the magnifying class. This is kind of the program, what I want to do today. I feel that currently, as already Mirek put it, it is kind of a new stage of metal studies in which direction that we are dealing with has a special relevance. And what I want to do today is I want to give a starting point, maybe some basic thoughts on how we can deal with what is important for that region at the moment, what are the crucial questions, and what could be an approach to go on from there in metal studies, exactly with the questions that are important for that region. So let me start. First with an introduction. So in recent years, metal studies has gained significant theoretical and empirical momentum. There's a lot of dynamics in the field. At the present, if we look at metal studies at the moment, it can be seen as something like a transnational and multidisciplinary project that addresses metal in two ways. On the one way, it addresses metal more and more on a global level. That means it goes all around the world. And at the same time, as Mirek already said, it is localizing metal. So one can put it that way, that metal studies is a project that looks at metal in such a multidisciplinary, multi-layered way. It is, you had the keynote of Anna-Katharina Höpflinger, I think that was in 2023, is that right? Or was it later? And Anna-Katharina Höpflinger said that at the moment, metal study is something like a mosaic. There are many, many different directions in metal studies, many ways of inquiries, many approaches. So it is a project that is very multifaceted, very different lines of inquiries, very dynamic and multidisciplinary. That means the current situation is that the main task actually is the programmatic task. What we should do at the moment is that we have to structure those many different lines of inquiries, that many different approaches, that many different disciplines, that many different voices that are there. What we really need at the moment in metal studies, and I think that is particularly true for Central and Eastern Europe, is that we have to structure dialogue. We have to structure the transnational dialogue between the scenes, between the fields, between the disciplines. And this is what I want to think about today, particularly in the context of the CEE region. What I will try to do is try to give some basic impulses for an approach how this could happen, how we perhaps can find some orientation on the crucial fields, on the crucial questions in the fields in this current moment. How does this come about? So I think due to its specific historical development since the 1970s, the CEE region, that is on both sides on the former Iron Curtain since about 1970, one can think here, for example, of countries like Germany, Austria, former Yugoslavia, of course, former Czechoslovakia, also the Baltic countries. So what we should aim at for, what we should look at it like, this is a transnational transfer space. There is no fixed definition of this region, but I think we have to look at it as a whole. What is crucial there is that since the 1970s, this transfer space, as I put it, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the former Iron Curtain, is characterized by pop culturals and subcultural streams. As the title of our conference already puts it, the history of metal in this region has all of the crucial issues of metal studies. There is evolution, there is transfer, there is challenges, there is controversies. I think this puts it in a nutshell. So I think it is fair to say that this region can be seen as something like a testing ground for all of the crucial problems and all of the crucial issues that are currently relevant in the field of metal studies. Exactly because of that history of transfer, It is mutual transfer, connections between the scenes, and it's very complicated and localized at the same time. So if we look at this region, at this transfer space, this concerns questions of transnational seal relations. It concerns questions of exchange. It concerns transfers across scenes borders. And mostly, this is crucial, it concerns interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary questions. The key problem in metal studies at the moment is to network, to find a way of fostering a dialogue between the many different voices in metal studies in our field. What I will try to do now in the next about 40 to 45 minutes is to use some examples from this region. There were already some mentioned also by Mirek, and try to work out something like a first network of this question. I will introduce a possible approach, how this can happen, how we can go on metal studies for this region. The approach that I will try to introduce as the core of my lecture is I refer to it as diasporic metal studies. That's the first time that I mentioned this at this point. This will be the key at the end of my lecture. It is, I have a base, there will be not a bias, but there will be a focus on transfer, and there will also be a focus on canon criticism. So I think what we need is we foster a dialogue that brings these very different lines of thinking together. Okay, so that you have an overview of what will be happening, I have 3 or 4 points. So I will share again the overview of my lecture. There are basically 4 points in my lecture, 4 sections. The first is I will have a look at the dynamics of innovation. As I want to say, I think that the dynamics of innovation in the field are pretty clear. Basically, it comes down to 2 trends. That will be my first step. The second step then going on from there will to take up those innovation dynamics and look what this exactly means. What are the crucial questions in the field at the moment? And most of all, for the region that we are thinking about, that will be the third step. I will have a look what are the what are the characteristics of the CEE region. The key notion there that I will use is transfer space, because as I said, I think we have to now to find new concepts, and we have to find new ways of thinking to get to a bigger picture, not only local and national scenes, but the interconnections between them. And the fourth point, that will be what I just mentioned, that I will to try flesh out that approach that I call diasporic metal studies, which will bring the other 3 steps together. So I hope you have a certain overview at what is going to happen. I hope to get it done in 40 minutes. If I'm too long, please interrupt me, or just if there's any questions, but I hope to keep that clock. Okay, I'm coming to the first point, the dynamics of innovation. So basically, in metal studies, there is a consensus that the whole field goes back to essentially 3 or 4 works. We all know them, the now classic works by Dina Weinstein, Roald Walsers, Harris M. Berger, Keith Kahn-Harris, amongst others. There are many others. So at the moment, we have about 30 years of research, scholarship, and history in the field. And that history has produced that mosaic that Anna-Katharina mentioned, that Anna-Katharina Höpflinger was mentioning. So at the moment, there's a multitude of perspective in the field, and that multitude is already reflected in the variety of notion that we use to analyze metal today. I will just mention a few. Depending on the viewpoint, on our backgrounds, on religion studies, I'm a historian. There are also sociologists in the field, musicologists, and many other colleagues. Just some notions that I used. Metal is referred to as a scene, a genre, a culture, a subculture, a soundscape, a discourse, a community, a network, a diaspora, and so on. You see already with the concept, it's very complicated. It's very different lines of inquiry, very many different disciplinary backgrounds. And the key problem is to bring that together, to network it. also with the many different national traditions in research. So if we look at the history of research at the moment, this can be seen as the construction of that mosaic. That mosaic provides this framework in which we develop our academic use of metal. As I have said, I think there are very many different backgrounds. There's a polyphony of voices, of academic voices in metal studies at the moment. But at its core, the field, and also mainly in the CEE region, can be characterized with two major trends, with two major characterizing trends that encapsulate the state of affairs in metal studies. The first trend that we can currently mention, that we can recognize, is the ever-increasing transnationalization of metal. That means more and more. So far, in many cases, we were looking at national scenes, we were looking at local scenes, and that is very important. But more and more, we are getting aware of the fact that there is a bigger picture, like we are looking for transnational connection between scenes. Mirek already mentioned the proposal that I'm currently developing for the Austrian Science Fair, that will look at the whole region on the board on the iron wall between Austria, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia. So basically, there's a trend to see metal more and more, and also metal studies, as something transnational, looking at the connections. If we change to the global level, think of the research on metal in South America, for example, the books by Nelson Varas Diaz. Usually, they are looking at the whole subcontinent. They are looking at the interconnections between the scenes in the context of decolonization. So basically, metal in South America can only be explained from such a transnational point of view. One can, of course, look at the local and national levels, but they were constituted in a transnational framework. The same applies to Asia, the same applies to Africa, the Middle East, and so on. And it is also no surprise, basically, Mirek in his introduction gave us half an hour of transnational metal studies history in Central and Eastern Europe. So transnational networks are developing. And also the connections between the nationally oriented networks, like we already had it, the Schwermetallstudien network in Germany, metal studies in Poland, metal studies in Hungary, that is growing together. So in a nutshell, more and more we are thinking of metal as something that happens on a local level in our direct life world, but it is influenced structurally by transnational, even global connections. And this is the first dynamic that really drives our field, that drives towards transnational perspectives, looking at those structures on the circulation all around the world, the circulation all around the region that we are looking at. And this development, this first trend, is relevant in two ways. First, it is empirically relevant. As I have said, it really enables us to see a bigger picture. With that, with looking at the connections, looking at the in-betweens, at the networks, we are seeing more of metal. So there will be more empirical knowledge with that, which is already true, for example, in South America. And the second point is, this is not only relevant in terms of empirical stuff, it's also relevant in terms of the normative perspective behind that. If we look at it from a transnational point of view, it means that transnational networks, we do not only see more, but also those cross-boundaries transfers, for example, around the Iron Curtain, are weighed differently. There's an emphasis on that. That means more and more we are seeing that metal is constitutively transnational. Basically, we can only think that metal has developed in transnational setting and terms. So 2 points why this is so relevant, this first innovation trend. It makes us see more data, and second, it gives us a different value approach to metal itself. It is seen from a transnational meta point of view. And I think that is really very relevant for going on from there in metal studies. The second point, the second trend of innovation that I think can be seen, also it's perfectly represented in the program of this conference, is the ever increasing trans and interdisciplinarity of the field. Of course, the aforementioned transnationalization also means that a multiplying number of different perspectives of different disciplines is involved. The number of backgrounds in the field is increasing, as is their level of interaction. As I said, consider only the backgrounds of the people at this conference. It's very broad, it's colorful, and often it's problematic to bring this together. So if we look back at the history of metal studies, going back to the 1990s and early 2000s, with the mentioned classic books, for example, by Robert Walser, by Keith Harris, Harris M. Berger, or Weinstein, then the situation was pretty different. Basically, it came down to 3 or 4 disciplines. That was musicology, that was cultural sociology, and that was cultural anthropology. That was a very different situation than now. So there were some founding disciplines, and like over 30 years, that changed a lot. What we have today is that what Anna-Katharina Höpflinger called a mosaic. So there is a highly pluralistic and multidisciplinary matrix of approaches in metal studies now. There are many more voices that need to be networked, that need to be connected in dialogue. And that is the second innovation dynamic. We have to work out that dialogue. That is the second trend in metal studies. Basically, what we need to manage between the discipline is we have to manage the dialogue between the scenes, that is interdisciplinary, and we have to manage the dialogue across the disciplines. That is the trans. And this is very relevant for the field today. It means that our views on metal are academically broadening. More and more, the view of metal is arising from such exchange. In a nutshell, metal studies is getting more and more dialogical in such terms, and that is very relevant. So I will now share again my screen to give you a summary of that first step. If I'm too fast or something, just interrupt me, or if there's any question. Okay, so as I said, there are 2 major trends. That is the transnationalization, that is the trans and interdisciplinization. And what follows from that, of course, the first step must be to go as far as possible into both directions of innovation in the next time. So if we assess the current state of metal studies, I think it is pretty evident that those 2 trends are driving the field. Metal is progressively being studied along these 2 lines of research of perspectives. Perspectives on or subjects of metal are becoming more and more transfer-oriented in those terms and multidisciplinary in nature. Therefore, the most important, the crucial questions that are arising at metal studies in 2026, what we have to think about is to have we explore metal in a way, and mostly for the direction that we are talking about, to go as far as possible into those 2 lines. Yeah? I think we have to manage discourse our research in a way that we manage to really think transnational, because that is the framework also for the local scenes. And we have to manage the trans and interdisciplinary dialogue. That is the first step. That is where we are currently in terms of change in the field. And that is very relevant if we think of now what exactly are the crucial questions in the field that are arising from this. Is that clear? So are there any questions at this point for the first step? So about where the field is at the moment. As I said, I really think that this course is important. If something is unclear, just throw your hands up or throw metal horns or whatever. I don't know. So I'm coming to my second step. Now, if we think that the field is changing in those terms, that it is getting more transnational and inter and transdisciplinary, then what exactly are the crucial questions that I have in my title? What exactly are the questions that we have to think about to get there? My second step is thus to formulate some of the crucial questions that are arising from this dynamics of innovation. I think in terms of the choice of concepts, I already mentioned some of them. We are talking of scenes, we are talking of networks, we are talking of musicking, of practicing, and so on. And also in terms of empirical areas, the focus should be on finding and networking and building a dialogue on questions that will help to move us forward exactly down this path. We have to find the core question that make us go the path of transnationalization, looking at the interconnections between the scenes, most of all the in between the scenes, the hybrid stuff that is there happening in between the scenes. And we have to foster the dialogue between the disciplines. Now, if we do this and we conceive of the resulting discourse, where it is going on from there, perhaps it makes even sense to see metal studies at the moment as something like maybe an experimental laboratory or something as this, something like a workshop where we have to find new questions, where we have to find the new terms. And if we do so, then we can think of all of this where we are going from here, there, as an open list of questions. I think this is very important. If we want to have dialogue, it's not about fixed questions, it's not about fixed directions. Is to see it as a talk, as a discourse, where we can see something like a process of ongoing questions. And to show you what I mean, I have put together a list, an open list of questions that could be important to go into that direction. And I will share that by now. Okay, if we are thinking about the crucial questions in the field, if we want to find those questions that drive us in conceptual and in empirical terms down that path, what exactly can that mean? This could be questions like, how actually do transnational transfers between scenes in metal come about? What exactly are those transfers? For example, Mirek already mentioned it. I'm currently developing a project on the transfers between the East and West, on the Iron Curtain between Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia at the moment. So one very simple could be, where are those transfers? When did they happen? Where did they happen? Who were the persons? Who were the venues? But the point is always to look at the transfers. So this could be a first question. A second question could be, how do those transnational and global flows, so the first and biggest layer, how does that connect with the local aspects that is so important? How then does the localization happen? Then, which concept, this goes to the theoretical notions, which concepts do we have to use to capture such processes? Is it transfer? Is it diaspora? Is it network? Is it all of it? So we have to think of the meta level. Then going on, I think it's also very important to think in terms of communication. What events do we need? What programs? What kind of workshop? So put down in the form on a question. What forms of dialogue between the disciplines do we need to achieve and nurture such research? Just what kind of workshop and networks do we need? Basically, very implicitly. Mirek was already also talking about that. Another question could be, how can we analyze metal in such a way that we truly master that between, that means the inter and the across, the trans between the scenes and the disciplines? That means we need a thought style, we need ways of thinking that really looks at those between places between the scenes and the disciplines. This is a very important question. And then, of course, fundamentally, what exactly are the where, when, how, and why questions about metal that lead us there? What are the places? What are the sites? What are the scenes? What are the networks in empirical terms that will us get there? So you see, what I'm trying to show you is that all of this is about a meta approach. It is very much about conceptual questions. I think we have to put an open question, an open list of questions that drives us there. It goes down to the core of transnational thinking and transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary thinking. So basically, what I'm trying to say is this crucial question are not fixed. That's an open list of questions, and I hope it is constantly evolving. It is a series of inquiries. It is a dialogical process. This is my second section, my second point. I think it can be summarized as follows. At the current stage of metal studies, the focus ought to be on that questions of a theoretical and empirical kind which cultivates such a new thought style. We need to find questions and answers that cultivate a transnational and multidisciplinary thought style in metal. This requires new strategies that structure our research around that bigger picture that I wanted to introduce in my introduction. For example, ideally, we should be able to capture the entire Central and Eastern European region, or at least larger parts and networks of it, which of course includes local manifestations. Therefore, the crucial questions are those that encourage us to nurture such a view. While the answers to those questions are, of course, always individual, but I think in general they can be understood in such a way that they throw a spotlight on these two developments. That is my second point. Is there any questions on this? Is this clear? I will go. Okay, is there questions at that point? No. Okay, I will just share again the one slide because it's something like a summary of what I was saying. Okay, in a nutshell, I think we have to find theoretical and empirical questions that are in line with those dynamics of innovations. And basically, this is all about dialogue. It's an open list of crucial questions. The aim has to be to find such a transnational and multidisciplinary thought style, perhaps even something like a theory of metal studies. Okay. That was my second step, and I now come to the particularities, the special characteristics of the CEE region, which is my third steps. Now I have tried to flesh out what is new in metal studies at the moment, and what are the crucial questions that arise from these innovation dynamics. So far we were on a very abstract level, we were on a very conceptual level, and it is necessary to bring it to the ground, so to speak. And we can do that if we look at the region itself. So what I want to do now is to think about what that exactly means, what new insights can be gained from that, what I have said so far, for the region that is the focus of our conference. I think if we go along this path, then innovation lies in viewing this region, as I have already said, as a transfer space. I think Mirek was already talking about the image that he had of for the conference. I will use it also. Many thanks also for your thoughts on using artificial intelligence. I think the map that you were showing us encapsulates it perfectly. What we have there geographically, the definition of Central and Eastern Europe will always be somewhat blurred. One can include, for example, Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, former Yugoslavia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. But one has not to. So the region is not fixed or something. There is no definition that is always true. So this definition is not fixed. But since around 1970, this space, this region, this network has been a space of constant circulation and immersion for popular music, for rock music, for hard rock music, and finally for metal. Jaroslav was talking of a golden age of metal in Czechia in the 1980s and 1970s, if I'm right. So probably we even can speak of Europeanization of metal in that region. So when they're already there, we have the shift of perspective. So the region cannot be described in essentialist terms or definition. However, what can be accurately described, what is fixed, is that this space, this region, has been a constant space of cultural and popular music transfer, of metal transfer throughout this entire period. About more than 5 decades now, there has been constant circulation. Of course, at the moment, at the beginning, it was small, but it started across the Iron Curtain already in the 1970s and 1980s. So if we look at the bigger transnational picture, we can see that throughout these decades, metal scenes emerged on both sides of the former Iron Curtain, as well as in the non-aligned countries of Yugoslavia and others. Now, if we want to reach an innovative perspective, something that goes beyond that has happened so far, then it is important to look at individual national and local scenes, but we should not stop there. There are already many excellent and national and local studies of this kind, and many more will come. However, if we want to come to a point where we can answer and think down along the lines of those crucial questions that I mentioned, then we have to look at Central and Eastern Europe in the sense of a transfer space. We should look at it as an area where metal music practices circulated all across the region, across national boundaries. There were building connections between the scenes. We should look how metal circulated there, how it circulated through the space and was then negotiated on a local level. And it came into our life world in those ways. So the region scenes were interconnected from the outset, even across the Iron Curtain. If we are focusing on such a view, on such a transnational view and interdisciplinary view, then we see that that region has been a region of constant circulation since around 1970. This has occurred from north to south, from west to east, but also the other way around. So if we want to know more about the region, if we want to come to more far-reaching conclusions, we have to foster dialogue about those interactions. We have to find the question, we have to look at the region as a transfer space that can stand down. And we only have to take up the many studies that are already existing at the moment. There are many examples that suggest that virtually all scenes in the region originated basically in transnational settings. I will share again what we have there. Just look at the map that we have seen. There is Poland, there's Czechia, there's Slovakia, Hungary, and so on. Of course, those are individual scenes, but they are connected in a network. There are streams between them. And we have to look at this as a whole scene, as a whole region. And that is so important. It is a transfer space. So just to mention some examples. Metal in Hungary, for instance, was in contact with the metal scene in Scandinavia and Germany. Just to show you an example, we all know Mayhem and we all know Tormentor. Just to give you those two examples. So the situation was that the Hungarian metal scene was developing on a local level, but it took up impulses from Germany, from Scandinavia, and so on. It means that scene found its local language, it took up the political system in Hungary, it took up local tradition, but it was built in a transnational setting. Also, what we already had, another example, was the Czech metal scene. Miroslav mentioned that it was something special and there was a golden age of metal in the 1980s. Is that the right term to put it? Of course, it was localized. That was what happened in the Czech language. It took up the situation behind the loosening Iron Curtain. But it was influenced by transfers from Germany, from Poland, from Austria, and so on. So also, this was an individual scene, but it happened in a transnational setting. So basically, again, the same thing. And then, of course, also the Austrian scene, which I know best. I had a research project on the Styrian metal scene on the border to Slovenia. What happened there? That scene also was individual in its own terms, but mostly it was characterized by networks to former Yugoslavia. There were networks between youth centers in Graz, the hometown I'm living in, an Austrian town, and youth centers in Croatia and Slovenia, and so on. And also there was, for example, the striking situation that one of the most well-known Austrian death metal bands, Punch and Stench, they had their first concerts not in Austria, but they had their first concerts in Czechia. So for them, the East was something like a testing ground. They were circulating their music and their identity to Czechia to find their place in metal. So there was transfer there. In short, there was circulation across all that place, across the transfer space of Central and Eastern Europe, as far the eye could see and as far as the fan's ear could hear. All of this was local and individualized, but it happened in transnational settings and networks. That is why the map that Miroslav was showing us is so fitting. It is, we have to think of that picture. We have to look at the CEE region as such a transfer place. So if we return to the identified dynamics of transnationalization and trans and interdisciplinary thinking, there are two aspects in which this is relevant for ongoing research in metal studies. The first point is it can be assumed, as I already mentioned, that all of these scenes were characterized by cross-border exchange, by transnational links, right from the formative phase. That means metal in Central and Eastern Europe is constitutively transnational. This is a transnational network entangled phenomenon. Therefore, to truly understand the transfer region, it means that we must explore its genesis and in history as such transfers between and in between the scenes. Secondly, that means that metal in this region has always been and continues to be a local manifestation of these transfers. There is that transnational networks and transfers are localized and concretized in individual settings. So to understand these manifestations of metal, those localizations of metal, those are enriched by local traditions, by local linguistic nuances, and all the unique social, cultural, and political facets. Therefore, we need the multi-layered perspectives of the mosaic that is already existing. And this can be developed through such interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary dialogue, the kind of list of questions that I tried to present you. So this means the many facets of metal in Central and Eastern Europe will only truly reveal themselves if we take such a multidisciplinary and dialogical approach to Central and Eastern Europe as such a transfer space. Okay, that was my second step. This I hope makes a bit of sense. And just because I have the feeling it is a bit abstract, I will also share again the slide on which this is kind of summarized. So basically, my hypothesis is I think that we should see direction as a transfer space. There's no fixed definition of direction. It can include different countries, but it must not. The key point is constant circulation and transfers between all the scenes in direction since about 1970. The aim should be to decode, to understand how the transfer space came about. So with that said, I'm coming to my final point. I'm coming to my fourth point, which I tried to introduce in the beginning, what I call diasporic metal studies. If we think about, so far we had 3 points. So I'm coming to my conclusion, and this is, I will try to draw the necessary conclusions from what has been said so far. As I said, my aim is to develop some fundamental ideas for a research approach that connects these crucial questions and establishing a starting point. I want to draw those lines together. Step 1, the innovation dynamics. Step 2, the crucial questions. Step 3, seeing the CEE region as a transfer space, and see how we can put that together in one concept. I refer to this approach as diasporic or diasporic metal studies, and I hope that this concept can serve as something like a stimulus for the discussions over our 2 conference days, and maybe even for further research. So now, before I go into details of this concept, I would like to recap the core elements that we had so far in my argument. Firstly, I examined the current dynamics of innovation in metal studies. As I said, that is a transnational and transcend interdisciplinary view. The second step was that I tried to identify the crucial questions in the field in respect of the Central and Eastern European region. I was claiming that this is an open list of questions that want us to drive down that path. As a third step, I proposed that we should understand the whole region as a transfer space in which metal was circulating all the time, all through the region. So this is the point where we are currently standing if we are studying metal in that region, more or less. At this stage, what is needed in metal studies is impulses, is an approach that can broadly guide research on this transfer space in accordance with those principles of transnationality and multi-perspectivity. This brings me to the core of my thoughts on what I try to refer to as diasporic metal studies. As this is the core idea of my talk, I will devote the remainder of my conclusion to it and try to give it some space. So if I get long, please simply interrupt me. I will then try to be shorter. So if we take the necessary distance from the discussion, it becomes quite obvious what research needs at the moment. The aim must be to formulate a meta-position, a meta-sense that views metal in that region as something that circulates transnationally and is then localized individually. It all comes down that we must establish a meta-position, a new approach that challenges the previously held notion the cliché of metal, that metal in that region would have only been a one-way street from the west to the east and from the north to the south. Basically, also in scholarship, there's still the narrative that this was a one-way street, something like a copy and paste model, where the canon of the new wave of British heavy metal would have been copied in Czechia, would have been copied in Hungary and in Austria and so on. That image of transfer from only west to east and north to south simply is not true. We have to tackle that. We need to find an understanding that brings them on from there and dissolves that distortion. So what do we have to do? Instead, we should focus on transfer, on mutual negotiation, and post-colonial impulses within this entire transfer space. We have to get there what Mirek Brizar deems a specific form of modernization and post-secularity for this whole region. So my thesis, my main impulse is that the conceptual framework of the diasporic, that means that an approach that is based on diasporic thinking, that one could go diasporic metal studies, can achieve this. The focus is on circulation, on how metal as a practice travels through space and time from both sides of the Iron Curtain. So if we look at the current state of metal studies, the notions of diaspora and diaspora are not completely new in the field. The notions have already been used, at least implicitly, for example, by Dina Weinstein when she was describing the globalization of metal. And more recently, I already mentioned it, for studying metal in Latin America. So there they were applied, the notion of diaspora there was applied to explain the context of decolonization. The crux is, the point is that in all the cases, the concept of diaspora so far has not been so really conceptualized. That means there are elements of such an understanding, of such a meta approach, but it has not been conceptualized through. It's not a point of view from where we could go on. There are elements of that. If we look, for example, at Weinstein's work, she explains the globalization of metal in terms of a diaspora, but doesn't exactly explain what diaspora is or how that does work. If we look at the works by Varas Diaz, there is the notion of diaspora, but in most cases, all of the questions are rather loosely connected, and they are put in an individual frame. So this is no surprise, because so far simply metal studies have a short history and didn't develop concepts and theory of its own. But that has changed. We need such concepts now. I think that we need a thorough concept of diaspora. So this is the bad news. We know what we have to do, but so far we didn't know what we have to do. But there also are good news. The good news is that in another area of popular music studies, and that is in the long-established field of jazz studies, more precisely in the field of new jazz studies and diasporic jazz studies, such a meta-position, exactly what we need, has already been cultivated. If we look at jazz studies, until around 2000, there was exactly the same situation. Jazz was seen as something like a transfer that would have originated in North America and would have been circulated all around the world in such a one-way street. But that changed. It's about 30 years. For example, at the institute where I'm currently affiliated, this is the Institute for Jazz and Popular Music Research at the University of Graz, another meta approach has been developed. That is diasporic jazz studies. Basically, there is all we need for metal studies. I will just share a slide with a book that is important there, which was just released. That is the Routledge Companion on Diasporic Metal Studies. There's a lot of it there from what metal studies could learn. So diasporic jazz studies has developed a notion of diaspora that provides precisely what we need in metal studies. an understanding of music as the transfer of musical practices, of music as transnational mutual interactions between scenes, and the subsequent examination and analysis of localized practices. Those practices then specify the global on the local level and bring it into a live world. As I said, canon criticism, reconstructing such claims of one West Street and thinking from the margins is crucial in shaping this metaposition. I only want to mention some influential scholars there that are, for example, Bruce Johnson, Tony Wheaton, Philip Schnicki, André Döring, Adam Habash from Hungary, and others. In principle, my hypothesis, my claim is that metal studies at the point that we are currently at only needs to take this meta position that was developed there since about 30 years and cultivated and adopt it and specify it for metal. This is the core of my thinking. This is what I think could be diasporic metal studies. Before I come to a close, I will give you 2 quotes from diasporic metal studies that pin that down. The first quote is how we can understand and define diaspora in such a way. Okay, this quote is by Tony Wheaton, a musicologist from New England. And now, if we are thinking of diaspora, what can a metaposition to analyze also metal look like? It is that we think of diaspora of music in a way that people in separate locations can effectively become part of a single community. Think here not only about active online communities, for example, but also about the way in which people, money, goods, and information circulate globally. Music has been distributed globally as a cultural commodity and through the movement of people across borders, times, and spaces. Exactly this what it is about, but we also need about metal. We need to have a framework that finds this out. So thus, diaspora can be understood as doing music under these diasporic circumstances. If we go back to the region that we are looking in, basically all of that region with all of those countries is a transfer space in that music was done according to that. It was about taking parts of the global metal canon, localizing at the individual level, and also mirror it back to the West, and so on. We need to think from a meta point that takes up what we see. Before I come to the conclusion, I want to give you another quote, which I think has the main impulse that will be important to go on from there. That is by the Hungarian scholar Adam Habash, who was researching the Hungarian jazz scene, and he published a book on that in 2022, I think. Okay. Habash writes, the main concern is the relationship between the broader dynamics of cultural globalization and the historically conditioned internal distinction within the diaspora. The trajectory clearly demonstrates that the music, that means not only jazz but also metal, was not passively incorporated into the host country's culture, but that, and that is the key sentence, it was invented in the course of being disseminated. The key is the notion that I put into italics. That is the key. I think in diasporic dissemination, music is constantly being reinvented. Also in the CEE region. This perspective defines a transnational and new metaposition, which is precisely what metal studies currently needs. Music is seen as a dynamic of cross-border circulations of practices that manifest themselves in local scenes. Applied to our region of interest, it makes little sense to only examine the Czech scenes, the Slovak scenes, Hungarian scenes, and so on, or parts of them in an isolated way. Even in their formative phases, those scenes were characterized by transnational exchanges, allowing the global to interact with the local. Even in the most insignificant Met locations of the early 1980s, the global was important. So what we need is a diasporic shift in perspective. Such a shift in perspective has profound implications. If we think of metal in those ways, then heavy metal in Central and Eastern Europe can no longer be seen even implicitly as a one-way history of exporting the Western heavy metal canon from the West and North to the East and South. Rather, it must be assumed that heavy metal, just like jazz, was invented in the course of being disseminated. Then the whole region, the Central and Eastern European region, is seen as a transnational transfer space that we can view in its entirety, including its many subscenes and their interconnections. I claim that we need to establish such a diasporic perspective. That is, we should understand metal studies in the CEE region as diasporic metal studies and network our research question and structure our research agenda in such terms. This brings the crucial questions of the field in that region into sharp focus. I think as if under the magnifying class. Therefore, the structure of the research agenda should be dialogical and collaborative in such terms. It should be transnational and multidisciplinary work on the metal diaspora in that region. Thus, my proposal is to talk about metal in that diasporic way. And with that, I come to my end and want to thank you for the patience. Thank you very much.